is it worth paying to live in those suburbs versus paying a lower price potentially to live outside the suburbs and sending your kids to a private school and paying that money to the private school instead of paying it to your loan interest? Which way do you go and which way might be better financially? When we start to look at property value growth in these suburbs, and by looking at the change in the median house price of each over the last 10 years and 20 years, what I found interesting is that we can't draw any major conclusions to say that you would have been better off living in there when we look at the typical cost to send your child to private school. Top tier private schools are around $25,000 to $30,000 a year to send your kids there. When we look at current interest rates being around 5.5%, that would give you the ability to repay an additional loan per year between $450,000 and $550,000. When we look at all of these factors, seeking out the public schools both as a homeowner and investor, it might not be the only factor that contributes to growth. When we do our trifecta review, it's one of the factors that we consider for the area, and we see quite starkly that a property that's one side of the catchment versus the other.
Welcome to Perth Property Insider, where you will learn how to grow your wealth and improve your life using Perth property. Our show is brought to you by Investors Edge Real Estate, the highly rated and award-winning property management, sales and buyers agency servicing the whole of Perth. Now, here's your host, Jared Mann.
G'day and welcome to today's episode where I'm having a deep dive on the top public secondary schools in Perth and seeing what sort of conclusions can I draw in terms of how their popularity affects the growth, and give you some input on weighing up, is it worth paying to live in those suburbs versus paying to a lower price potentially to live outside the suburbs and sending your kids to a private school and paying that money to the private school instead of paying it to your loan interest? Which way do you go and which way might be better financially? So when I started going into all the data, I thought there'll be easy conclusions to draw. But what I've really found is that with the stage of the cycle that we're in at the moment, we've had our growth starting in the bottom end. It's now moving into the middle as people upgrade and use their equity from the lower end suburbs. And then it'll probably finish the cycle in the top end if it's not interrupted as the middle upgrades into the top and the growth ripples through the market from bottom to top. We did also have some growth during the COVID period at the upper end of the market, which sort of kicked us off. And then when affordability started to bite and interest rates started to increase, the growth moved very quickly down to the bottom end, and the lower end growth stagnated. So I think as the cycle coincides and the interest rates come back down, we'll also see that growth supporting the middle and top end suburbs and people being able to borrow more to get into there and use their equity from the upgrades to do that too. And I know we've got a big cross section of listeners from home buyers to investors, and so I'm going to break it down and sort of think about things from both perspectives. And your home can also be your greatest investment. So I'm going to speak to both living there and investing there and renting it out. Now, let's take a look at the top 10 public schools, and this is based on the Better Education ranking system. And by no means it's the only measure of quality of schools, but it's certainly one that I'd say a majority of people look at. And for the purpose of today's podcast, I'm just focusing on the top 10. I'm sure if you're looking at the top 20, top 30, top 40 schools, they're all going to be of a certain high quality compared to if you're comparing something that's at the bottom end of the list. So relative comparisons are important, and you might not be able to discern a school in the top 10 versus a school in the top 20 or top 30. So keep that in mind. Now, when we look at the list, Perth Mod is at the top. That's an inner city area school, and that's consistently at the top of the school rankings. I believe it's not accessible through catchment purely, so I won't really put too much analysis around that. I believe it's through application and they accept outstanding students in a variety of different modalities. So don't believe that's a catchment-based school. But then when we look at the rest of the top 10, we've got Willetton at number 2, Rossmoyne at number 3, Shenton College at number 4, then got Applecross at 5, John Curtin College in Freo at 6. We've got Mount Lawley Senior High at 7, Churchlands at 8, which is in the western suburbs, Leeming at 9, and Melville at 10. So when I look through this list and see where the locations are based, it's interesting to note that 6 of these schools are in the inner south of the river, and that's where the majority of these top 10 are. When I'm talking about those 6, I'm referring to Leeming, Melville, John Curtin, Freo, Applecross, Rossmoyne, and Willetton. So a real high concentration of schools in that inner south there. And you can almost live in any suburb in that inner south and go to a great public school. So I ask myself, has that come about because the western suburbs has mainly got private schools, which it does? So therefore, they're not appearing in this list. And of course, any quality private school, I'm not talking about appearing in this list either, not just western suburbs ones. 2 of these schools were based in the western suburbs, Churchlands and Shenton College. So you'd kind of expect with the dollars and extra resources available in those areas that they'd be supportive of more quality education potentially. 2 of these were the inner schools, which I mentioned was Perth Mod and Mount Lawley. So Mount Lawley's consistently sort of been in that top 10 for a long time, and it's relatively easy to get to for a lot of those inner north suburbs. So really, that's probably the only suburbs that is on the north, but it's still, I would call, more of an inner school. And interestingly, that left no real northern-based public schools in the top 10. So come on, North, what's going on? So when we start to then look at property value growth in these suburbs, and by looking at the change in the median house price of each over the last 10 years and 20 years, what I found interesting is that we can't draw any major conclusions to say that you would have definitely been better off living in there growth-wise when I compare it to neighbouring suburbs that are often lower in price, because these lower price suburbs have attracted a lot of the heat because of that affordability factor over the last 10 years and even over the last 20 years. So there was no discernible major growth advantage to living in these top suburbs, at least over the last 20 years, if we're just looking at that segment. And I didn't think it was relevant to necessarily look back any further than that, because they might not have always been in the top 10 list. And it's probably what is most relevant in terms of timeframes for people, because, if we go back further, it starts to become a lot more skewed and could be relevant if you've held it for a very long time. But what would be most relevant for us is to check in on this again at the end of the cycle, when the middle and top suburbs have ended up growing by as much as the bottom end suburbs, or have completed their stage in the cycle. And then we could make a more, accurate comparison with some of the middle and lower end suburbs that are around these suburbs that have the more quality public schools in them.
Just real quick before we continue on with the episode, are you getting my email updates yet? If you're not, you're missing out on our suburb intelligence reports, which we tailor and prepare for your individual suburbs of interest, showing advanced stats and insights. You must get onto those. And I also send out exclusive invitations to our events, including webinars, sundowners, and workshops. So if you're not getting those, head on over to investorsedge.com.au/join and make sure you're receiving my email updates.
But what I do know is that despite the growth mainly being focused on the bottom end, these suburbs have still done incredibly well. The 5-year change varies from 53% at the lower end in Rosmoyne, and I found that interesting because Rosmoyne has always had that public school popularity to it. And then we look at some of the suburbs like Willetton, Leeming that have done exceptionally well at close to 80% growth over the last 5 years. So potentially the affordability factor, it would seem, has also meant that people have sought out those suburbs that have a median house price now of around 1.24 million for both of those suburbs. Whereas when we compare it to Rossmoyne, which is at the top of the list, other than somewhere like Applecross, which is at the very top of the list. So Rossmoyne is at 1.78 million and Applecross at 2.85. So we can't always discern, or we can't discern at any point, is it the school that brings popularity and desirability to the area and therefore demand? Or is it the location and all the fabulous amenities that are on offer? And when you look at where these schools are located, most of them are next to the river. Most of them have great infrastructure, great level of amenities. Mount Lawley's got its cafe strips and its relative distance to Perth. When we look in the inner south suburbs, they are all on the river and very desirable. And also, when a suburb by its nature has a higher price point, it's going to be more desirable, have more desirable homes to live in and be a more desirable location. So I was really hoping to come to you and give you some stark differences between the growth rates and show clearly at the moment that the public schools have still outperformed the lower price areas that are not as highly ranked in the schooling rankings, but I can't do that. What I can do is flash back to one of my first episodes that I ever recorded where I looked at the growth rates, and I think this was around 2020. I'll have to go back and find it and can include it in the show notes. But at that point, I remember the study that I did, and I found that it was around a 2% average annual growth rate difference when I looked over the long term over a 20-year period, and that didn't have the most recent growth factored in. It really had every suburb at a fairly even starting point looking backwards in time. So while I don't have the data now to support it, I can refer to that study that I did previously where I found that it was as much as a 2% growth rate on average per year that you gained from being in the better public school catchment, that is. So now when we look at what were some of the other factors to consider about how these schools might relate to the market, we've typically found that in addition to stronger potential price growth over the long term, the days on market for these areas has always been very tight, even in downward markets. So they're a lot more resilient. This carries across to what can be said for the rental market too. So anytime we rent a property that's in the Rossmoyne school zone or the Willetton senior high school zone, we know that we've got families that are coming as tenants that are purposely seeking out a house to live in this area. And in many cases, they would trade off quality of the house and live in houses that they may not even consider if it wasn't in that school zone. So it can play a big part in maintaining the resilience and your ability to sell in a downward market, as well as your ability to attract tenants in a downward market. And because the prices are typically a bit higher, rental yields are typically a bit lower. And you'd expect that when overall returns usually equate to around 10%. If you're getting higher growth on average over the long term, you'd expect a slightly lower rental yield because the home buyers are pushing things up and prepared to pay the extra for house prices in the area, which doesn't always keep exactly in track with what the rental yields are like. So other considerations, and I found this to be particularly important for the home buyers. Now, when we look at the typical cost to send your child to private school, top tier private schools are around $25,000 to $30,000 a year to send your kids there. When we look at current interest rates being around 5.5%, that would actually give you the ability to repay an additional loan per year between 450 and 550,000. So if you've got multiple kids going there at the same time, that could potentially be anywhere from $1 million to $1.5 million of extra borrowing that you could afford just on the private school fees that you'd save alone to send your kids to the public school instead. So very worth considering seeking out these catchments just purely from a saving point of view of what you won't spend on private school fees you can put into your house. And those figures I've quoted is for interest only loans. So you will have a bit of extra principal to pay if you're making principal repayments. So keep that in mind as well. Now, when we look at all of these factors, seeking out the public schools, both as a homeowner and investor, while it might not be the only factor that contributes to growth, when we do our trifecta review, it's one of the factors that we definitely consider for the area. And we see quite starkly that a property that's one side of the catchment versus the other, when we look at individual property growth rates, not talking suburb level, but we're talking property level now, can be starkly different. And so we're always looking to buy into a school zone that is better for the area if we had the choice. Hope this has been of help. And if you want any follow-up on the primary schools, let us know. And I'll be sure to come back to you towards the end of this growth phase to do a check-in again as to whether it's showing up in the 10-year and the 20-year growth rates when we make the comparison. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to share it with family and friends. Give us a like, post a review if you're on podcast or podcast platforms such as Spotify or iTunes. And get in touch every month, every week. We're hearing from property investors, homeowners to get their help with their property journey. We've got strategy, buyer's agency, property management, and sales. I'm sure we can help you on your journey too. So thanks for tuning in. Catch you on the next one.
Just a reminder, the information discussed in this podcast is general in nature. As we don't know your specific situation, you should always seek professional advice before taking any action. For free market reports on your suburbs of interest and other helpful resources to grow your wealth, make sure you join my property investor update at investorsedge.com.au/join. And finally, make sure you're a member of our Perth Property Investment Facebook group to be part of the conversation with other like-minded investors, get help to your questions, and get a feel for what's going on out there in the market. I'll see you in the group.